This webinar is being hosted by Beyond Toxics and the NAACP Eugene Springfield branch here in Oregon. And so my name is Haley K. Scott, and I'm the Climate Justice Grassroots Organizer for Beyond Toxics and the NAACP. And I'm a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians here. And I'm so happy that we are joined by a great lineup of panelists and a moderator. And so before we get started, I do want to give a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we are on Kalapuya Alihi, the homelands of the Kalapuya people in the Willamette Valley. Their descendants still live here, and we are honored to share the land and take part in its safekeeping, its resources for future generations. We commit to respect the rights, traditions, and knowledge of the Winfeli Kalapuya people. Thank you. So Crystal, if you can advance to the next slide, please. So just a quick shout out and thank you to our donors who made this webinar possible in our past webinar series. Next slide, please. So just a few quick webinar logistics. So all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. And for our Q&A section at the end, please put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you can also use the chat function if you want to talk with someone you may know here on the webinar, but just make sure that it is private, otherwise it will go to all panelists and attendees. Next slide, please. And so just a quick agenda of what the webinar or how it's going to be structured today. So we're going to do introductions here in a minute, then it'll be followed by moderated panel presentations, and then at the end we will have a panel Q&A. And so now I'm going to hand it off to our moderator for today's webinar, Benjamin Duncan, the Chief Diversity and Equity Officer for Multnomah County. So take it away, Ben.
Okay, thank you, Haley. And I'll start by again, really thanking Beyond Toxics and the Eugene Springfield branch of the NAACP for this opportunity today to be in conversation with these incredible leaders. And also just appreciate all the folks who are virtually joining us for this timely and really critical conversation around this theme of right to clean air. And as Haley discussed, we'll move through some scripted questions to start and then really leave some time for Q&A with our audience. To start, I'm always interested in what drives folks to do this work and know that for so many of us that we engage in this work, we sustain in this work because of who we are and what our experiences reflect. And I really want to start, not by kind of walking through a bio per se of kind of what have you done and what's your accomplishments, but more so asking each of you to introduce yourself, and in doing so, kind of talk about what motivates you and drives you in this work, talk about the role that you play that brings you into the work every single day. So Anna, I'm going to start with you. Can you talk about your background, experience, and kind of what sustains you as you do this work?
Yeah, so again, my name is Anna Molina. I'm the Statewide Environmental Justice Projects Manager here at Beyond Toxics. My role here has been as an advocate and organizer for our Black, Indigenous, people of color communities in Eugene and across the state to ensure that our voices are being heard when it comes to decision making. How I came to this work was after graduating with my undergrad in ecological restoration and looking at environmental health and how we make ecosystems better, but realizing that there was a lack of acknowledgement in the way that Black, Indigenous, people of color are adversely impacted by those same environments. In a way, environments and the built environment that we live in. I remember one of my classes, like my environmental classes, there was like one class of environmental justice, and I remember my professor saying, oh, we don't have time to get into all of like the ways that people of color are impacted by the environment. And I was like, but this is the environmental justice topic of the class. And so that didn't sit well with me. So I was really wanting to pursue that work, and having done some undocumented student organizing, having been part of a sustainable student center at Humboldt State University, and having gardens and workshops and things that like our communities already know and don't do it as something that's a luxury, but in order to survive, really brought me into this work. And so I was really wanting to pursue that work that prioritized environmental health for both people and the environment. And so that led me to work with Beyond Toxics, which seemed like a really good fit because they were working on tying those topics together while working with the community directly that's impacted. So that's kind of what brought me to this work, because one of the things that I wholeheartedly believe in when doing this work, and that comes up to me very often, is that what we do to the people, we do to the planet. So if we're polluting, like what we do to our planet, we do to the people. So like if we're polluting our environments, we're polluting our natural resources, we're going to be doing that to the people who live there. And that's one of the things that drives me when doing this work, this environmental justice work. It's not just to protect our natural ecosystems, but protect it for the health of the people who live here as well.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And Mary, you know, doing air toxics policy, I mean, I think it's especially, right, that concept of sustain, right? And especially when you're in that policy world and the complexity and the timelines and the frustrations. Talk a little bit about your background and story. How did you get involved in this work? And again, how do you sustain and through all of this complexity of policy work in relation to air toxics?
Thank you, Ben. And I want to thank Beyond Toxics. I just want to take a minute to thank them for convening this. And I want to thank Ben and all my fellow panelists, because this is really an honor to have this conversation today and be part of this. Yeah, you know, I used to call myself an accidental activist because I really just came into this work by stumbling one day looking for the farm to school lunch program, and instead found a national study about industrial air pollution and America's schools. And it had a search engine, and I put my daughter's school, which happened to be in Northwest Portland, Chapman Elementary School, into the search engine, and was astounded to see it come up as in potentially the bottom 2% in the country of exposure to dangerous industrial air toxics. You know, I've actually kind of adjusted my framing, because I don't think there is anything accidental about mothers or parents. I don't want to totally gendify it, but you know, protecting the health and well-being of our children. So there wasn't really anything accidental about that motivating me. I would say it's probably very accidental based on my background, coming from athletic consumer marketing to become an executive director of an environmental nonprofit to deal with the problem. The study that popped up in this Google search used EPA national data with toxic release inventory data that came from EPA, and looked at America's schools. And while I found my school to be in the bottom 2%, my first reaction was to organize my neighbors, or to really, I didn't even consider myself an organizer. I considered myself an information sharer, to share that information with my community, neighbors, friends, family, the school community, and assume that we would all feel as concerned. And they did. And we came together and we demanded that the company do something about it. And we achieved a direct contract with the company to invest $5 million to reduce the toxic air emissions that were coming into our neighborhood. And I was really proud of that, and I still am really proud of that achievement. But it also revealed a much bigger problem, and it revealed a much bigger gap, between what's regulated and what's safe in terms of air pollution, but also the fact that the community had to do this on our own. We didn't have the help. The regulators didn't step in. The politicians didn't step in. We had to do this on our own. And at the same time, when this same national study that I learned about the risk in my neighborhood, there was no school in Portland that actually ranked better than the bottom 30%. And in fact, the most dangerous levels modeled in this study were in North Portland. And one specifically always stood out to me. It was Cesar Chavez, elementary school in North Portland, that if you looked at the risk profile, the same one that galvanized our neighborhood and we got $5 million of action to take care of, the risk looked exactly the same. It was heavy metals coming from steel, a different steel company, heavy metals, and it put this school in the bottom 2% in the nation as well. So the only difference between the outcomes at these two different schools, Chapman Elementary School and Cesar Chavez, was the makeup of the community. That was really the only difference. The community that Cesar Chavez students represent represent a higher percentage of Black and Brown, represent a higher percentage of non-English speaking, or non-English as, English as a second language, and lower income. And so there has never been, as far as I know, any testing or monitoring done around that school, any assessment at risk, and certainly no engagement with the company to reduce the emissions. So I became really aware that the system was failing because it wasn't regulating the risk. It was possibly at best, adapting or reacting to individual, communities' crisis, but the system itself was failing to protect and ensure everybody clean, safe air. And shortly after this experience, or during the middle of this experience, this is when I actually got to meet Ben, and it's been a decade, Ben, since we got to sit on the Portland Air Toxic Solutions Advisory Committee together. And so here I was enmeshed in this idea that industry was a huge risk. It was, impacting and affecting communities. But the Portland Air Toxic Solutions was a project convened by Oregon Department of Environmental Quality that showed the risk from all sources of air pollution. And what I soon learned was that industry, honestly, unless you lived right next door to industry, it was a smaller percentage of the impact, and the much bigger impact affecting our air quality was from diesel and the use of older diesel technology, diesel engines creating diesel particulate matter. And this also was a bigger environmental injustice because there were also known to be concentrations of diesel particulates 3 times higher levels in census tracts that had higher percentage of Black residents. And so what was happening on the history of the diesel problem? What I learned really quickly was by being able to talk to the smart people who've been doing this work a lot longer than I have, an original organization called EJAG that became OPAL, led by a woman, Jerry Jimenez, was in 2006, our governor had convened a North Portland air quality diesel emissions reduction Oregon Solutions project because they knew, the state knew, EPA knew, Multnomah County knew that diesel emissions were causing adverse health effects in the Black community in North Portland. And so in 2006, they addressed that. In 2007, the state legislature directed the EQC to address diesel emissions by setting a key performance marker for them to reduce diesel to no more than 1 in a million, which happens to be the acceptable risk level. And then a whole lot of nothing happened. There wasn't a galvanizing of the community. There wasn't a coming together. In 2016, we got our first big breakthrough on air by the US Forest Service showing us that there were toxic hotspots of heavy metals and industry across our city. And we did get a fast-tracked new industrial air permitting program to start to address that. But again, diesel emissions, which were causing infinitely more risk, and again, in environmental justice communities, continue to lag. So we've had some breakthroughs recently, but I think that the difference in policy that you see on how we've moved on diesel versus how we've moved even on industry, when industry started to be a problem in the governor's backyard, and we started to see some of the issue of that arising, but we continue to let diesel emissions adversely affect the outcomes. And we're learning more every day. We learn more and more about the impacts, not just on health and cancer, but on cognitive development, school performance, just a whole bunch of social determinants of health that create a continued barrier to fight against. It is, I think, still the biggest injustice we have in our system, that we aren't being more aggressive and have the same urgency around this diesel exposure as we do in other air toxics. And I mean, to bring it back to the personal, while I do think it's the right thing to do, I will also say I firmly believe that the system doesn't work and doesn't keep any of us safe until it keeps all of us safe. And that is something that I fundamentally believe, and I'm deeply invested in that principle, that we need to regulate the air at the hyper-local level of where it's impacting the most people at the highest levels. And then we are all breathing clean, safe air. And until we do, none of us are. So that's really what motivates me every day. But it's still, even with the interventions, even with the progress, there is still way too much onus on the community itself and community capacity to make this happen. And the system just has not changed enough to be protective of public health.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. And I think you're giving us a preview of some of the other conversation that we'd like to have today. Moving to you, Tony. I mean, I feel like every time I talk to you, you got a new brilliant idea that you're working on, all in service to community, and just continue to push the kind of boundaries and our collective imagination about how to do community work. But can you talk about kind of your role and again, what sustains you and gives you that motivation?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Appreciate the question. And good to be with you all. You know, this is, I think, some of the most challenging times that our communities have been in, and at the same time, some of the most promising for change. And so it really, truly is an honor and a privilege to be with you all here today. And I want to thank Beyond Toxics for their sustained leadership in this space for many years. At least Arkin in particular, thank you. And also to NAACP, thank you. Really appreciate the leadership you all are doing, not just in Lane County, but also across the state. You know, I've come to this work from a very personal perspective. I was almost in the vein of an accidental air toxics warrior, kind of like you, Mary, but in a little bit different way. I graduated from Humboldt State University. Go Lumberjacks, Anna, in like 1998. And I moved back to, I had 3 job offers. I wanted to be a park ranger. I always dreamed of being a park ranger, a national park ranger. I had 2 job offers from national parks, and I had a 3rd job offer from this thing called the National Wildlife Federation. And I had no idea what the National Wildlife Federation was. But it was close to my grandmother. My grandmother lived in Toledo, Ohio, and the job was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, about an hour away. And so kind of sight unseen, picked up, moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and was completely scared out of my mind by what I heard on like day 2 of the job. There was a well-esteemed group of folks working on air toxics for many years in the Great Lakes. And I'll never forget hearing a lecture about dioxin and just being like scared out of my mind. And like I was like, what the hell is going on here? I knew about like smog growing up in LA and Orange County. And, you know, when I was a kid, we were told, oh yeah, you know, it's only a stage 2 smog alert. Get out there and run around. You're going to be fine. And oh, it's a stage 3 smog alert. Maybe you shouldn't play too hard today, but you can still go outside and play. So then I was like, okay, you know, I'm in. And I learned a lot. You know, I learned a lot about air toxics, and I learned a lot about community organizing, and I learned a lot from environmental justice folks who are working on shutting down medical waste incinerators in Detroit, including my partner now of 20 years, Molly Chidsey, who was part of that group and taught me what I know now still about community organizing. But the thing that really brought it home for me was losing my grandmother to what was diagnosed by the hospital or the death certificate when she died as emphysema. She never smoked a day in her life, 83 years. But she lived next door to a Sun Oil Company refinery. And like so many sacrifice zones in our country, the folks that are the fence line neighbors to these facilities suffer. And they suffer because of lack of investment in our regulatory system, industry capture of our regulatory system, and the ability of polluters to pollute with impunity for a long, long time. And so, for me, that was born out of that kind of like both personal and seeing that community injustice. And I really dedicated myself to now what's a lifelong effort around environmental work, and really seeking to infuse environmental and social justice. So currently I serve in the role here at VERDE as the executive director. I also serve as the board chair of the Coalition of Communities of Color. And I think what really sustains me in the work all these years later and all the time in between is really the sense that our communities have ever slowly but ever steadily taken more and more agency over who dictates the agenda for environmental protection and how we both create environmental protection efforts around air quality, but also how those benefits come into our communities. And when I talk about that in the roles I've played, it's really important not just to think about looking at ratcheting down numbers of pollutants, which is important, and I'll talk more about that later, but also, what are the economic benefits, making sure that the economic benefits of our environmental protection efforts come to our communities, and making sure that long-term, the folks that have been most impacted by the burdens of air pollution are now the leaders. And that's sort of like, what's most important to me in this phase is really just kind of like being the technical resource and, creating the resources necessary for folks to come in and lead, creating those templates where we've learned things and want to share. But I'm just so inspired in this moment right now of, seeing lots and lots of young folks out in the streets demanding an end to essentially what are white supremacy and patriarchy for too long dictating not just the systems of police violence against our communities, but the same systems that essentially dictate who wins and loses when it comes to environmental amenities, pollution, degradation, and where environmental benefits are established. And so that's, I think, a little bit about where I've come from and where I'm at and what sustains me.
Great, thank you to each of you for sharing that personal part of yourselves, and again, really starting at that individual level. I will say, Tony, it's not too late to be a park ranger, so you don't have to give up on that dream. But moving now from that individual personal story, and Tony, it's been a nice segue because I think what you ended on was really around the concept of movement building, and really environmental justice is about a movement. And it's centered on the relationship, and I know Mary and Anna, you each spoke to it, right? The relationship between race and income and place, and this right to a healthy environment in the places where we live, we learn, we work, we play, we practice spirituality. And today's theme, right, around the right to clean air means a lot right now, right? In the context of a movement for Black lives, in the middle of a global pandemic, and of course in relationship, as you each spoke to your personal stories, and right, to extrapolate the personal stories of so many folks in our communities that will be driven for change. Mary, I want to start with you because I think obviously you alluded to some of this, right? Your work is focused on air toxics broadly, and you started really getting into diesel in particular. And I wonder if you can speak to that relationship between diesel and environmental justice, and particularly in the context of where we are right now. But could you talk a little bit more about kind of diesel specifically?
Yeah, I mean, quick tutorial, diesel is the most dangerous thing in our air, and it's dangerous because it's the ultrafine particulates. They're really tiny particles. We don't always see them. It's not the smog you see, although sometimes they come out in big black plumes from engines. But they attach onto these molecules and they get absorbed deeply in, so they break the lung to blood barrier, and that's when they start causing even more problems. They go to our brain and other organs. And so diesel is very dangerous and it's very deadly. And I think that what's interesting is the more we learn, the more connected and related it is to so many other, outcomes, especially around neurodevelopmental and cognitive. And it even as being diesel exposure, schools' proximity to diesel exposure has been documented in a national study by the Economic Research Board on school outcomes and school performances of students there. So you have this element in this exposure, and now we're finding, the exposure, air pollution exposures, how it exacerbates and intersects with the COVID exposure. I mean, so it's a constant, it's a constant assault on certain populations to be, under assault from these environmental toxics that make every other challenge that we're all dealing with even that much harder. And when it's not recognized and it's not seen, that makes it even more difficult for, I think, certain communities to be able to deal and address it. And so I feel like the fact that we have known for so long, and the fact that not only do we know in Oregon, we've known for so long that this has been impacting Black and Brown communities at higher rates in Oregon. You know what? Our neighboring states have known for a really long time, and that's actually put us more at risk because they have moved on this as being a very dangerous contribution to the problem of air pollution and the impacts on communities, to the point where they actually were benefiting, if you will, by the dumping of equipment that's no longer legal in California or otherwise being incentivized strongly in Washington to be gotten rid of, is coming to Oregon because Oregon says, hey, we're still open for business for this stuff here. So I think that the problem being one that is, to me, everybody acts as if air pollution was something we didn't really know about and we didn't understand. And the deeper you dig into it, you realize we knew a lot. This has never been bereft of data. It's been bereft of the community mobilization to deal with it. And I don't mean that that's the community's fault. It's the community capacity. And it is difficult to deal with air pollution that feels maybe arm's length from negative outcomes in your life when you're dealing day to day with really clear issues of, oh my gosh, my asthmatic child has to stay home again today. I have to take them, to the hospital. I'm going to have to talk to my boss about, how I can get out, how that's going to jive. I mean, the things that this is contributing to create day-to-day stresses and hassles that are really the immediate actions that people are having to take and defend. And it's the same with the COVID. I think the virus impacting, you're not thinking about the diesel engine contributing to that. So I guess that's what I think is it feels to me that's why we need the systems and the governance to step in, because they do know. They know what, individuals can't control and can't take care of. And they do know, and I feel like it's a moral injustice that we've known for this long and haven't been willing to take as urgent of action as the governor did when she ordered a cease and desist at a facility that was frankly really close to her house in Oregon because of potential dangerous emissions. Where's the cease and desist on dangerous, really dangerous pollution in all our communities?
Great, thanks, Mary. Tony, obviously Mary has just kind of talked about a very particular hazard in communities, and your work in the Cully neighborhood really speaks to this, really core concept of both public health and environmental justice around cumulative impacts and environmental hazard, and particularly where those compounding impacts show up for EJ communities. What does that look like in Cully? Like, localize this conversation in terms of what communities are bearing the brunt of.
Sure, thanks, Ben, and thank you, Mary. I like I mentioned earlier, it really is an honor to be on this panel, and I really do want to honor the work of Mary. She doesn't toot her own horn a lot, but one of the things I think it's important to recognize among folks is just evolution of leadership, and I think we all have opportunities to evolve and grow and build our awareness and our analysis around race and gender and other forms of repression and bring those into the work. And I think I've seen Mary steadily do that over many years. So I just a note of appreciation to you, Mary. For those of you that don't know, the Cully neighborhood where VERDE is based is located in Northeast Portland. It's kind of wedged between the 205 freeway, 42nd Avenue to the west, the airport to the north, and Fremont Avenue, Fremont to the south. It's one of the last close-in neighborhoods in Portland that has not experienced really, broad displacement of low-income people and people of color. It's still very diverse. It's about 50% white, 50% people of color, with really large numbers of Latinx folks, Black folks, African immigrant folks. And what's really special about the neighborhood, I think, is just the amount of civic activity in the neighborhood. It's got really, I think, one of the best neighborhood associations in the city. First neighborhood association to hold all of its meetings in English and Spanish, to provide childcare. First neighborhood association to explicitly create an anti-displacement and support for affordable housing. And then it's home to organizations like the Native American Youth and Family Center, Hacienda Community Development Corporation, and VERDE. And so there's just a lot going on here to really drive environmental investments into the neighborhood, but do it in a way that really centers anti-displacement. And so the Living Coley Coalition, which many of you may have heard about, has been operating for about 10 years. And at the same time, we've been working to drive environmental investments into the neighborhood. We've also purchased collectively among the organizations in Living Coley enough land, around 20 plus acres of land, that can sustain hundreds and hundreds of units of affordable housing into the future, some of which have already been built and some of which are in development. The neighborhood also suffers from extreme air pollution. It was in that Forest Service study that Mary noted, 5 of the toxic pollutants showed up in the neighborhood at the highest levels anywhere in the region, things like cobalt and chrome-6. We've got 2 essentially freight corridors that bisect the neighborhood, Columbia Boulevard and Portland Highway. And we've got a number of point sources in the neighborhood, like Owens Brockway, which is a glass recycling facility, and Porter Yet, which is an asphalt grinding operation. And what I would say here is that the community is suffering deeply from all of that pollution. It's been suffering deeply for a long time, and Beyond Toxics has graciously offered to host a video that we produced recently with community members talking about the impacts of that pollution to them personally and to their families. And so please look forward to that on the Beyond Toxics page. And the community has also been active, but in a very limited capacity. And we've been working closely with the Department of Environmental Quality, the Oregon Health Authority, Multnomah County, and others for a number of years, really, and kind of being collaborative and patient. And we are fed up and tired. We are fed up and tired, and COVID is making it worse. We know that. We know that this is a respiratory disease, and we know that additional impacts to our respiratory systems is not good. And so I think, for us, we want to see much more radical action from our city, our region, and our state on criteria pollutants and toxic pollutants. And so, what I want to share with you all briefly, for those of you that are in positions of decision making, but also those of you that can mobilize your constituencies, is 2 things. One is that on the Owens Brockway facility, we need action right now. This is a facility that has operated with impunity in our neighborhood for many years. It has been able to legally release up to 200 pounds of lead onto our low-income and people of color communities. It has never modeled or tested criteria pollutants. It has exceeded its limits for toxics on 83 occasions. And while we're hopeful that Clean Air Oregon can bring us relief with a stronger permit for this facility, we've also seen that interim permit from the state is not nearly strong enough. And we had to go to the extraordinary length of asking the federal government imagine asking the Trump administration for relief right now. We've asked the Trump administration for relief to fix the permit to ratchet down those emissions so that they are protective of human health in our neighborhood. So we need immediate action from Governor Brown on this today. The second is on diesel, and what we're really wanting to share with you all is simply that we think it's time for really getting more aggressive on action on-road and off-road diesel. In our neighborhood, as I mentioned, we have those 2 freight corridors, but we also have a number of facilities that host off-road construction type vehicles that basically spew unregulated emissions from diesel engines and have dirty old engines operating. And so what I'd like to see, I think we haven't really launched this formally yet, but I'd like to see increased fees placed on diesel that operate in our city and our county. Those fees creating a fund that can pay for swap outs and replacements, especially for minority and women-owned businesses to upgrade their fleets. That can pay for community groups to build their capacity to be more active in rerouting freight through our city and other forms of reducing air pollution on the most impacted communities, and helping low-income people and people of color actually get cleaner vehicles of their own. We don't want to see people being left out of opportunities to have cleaner forms of transportation themselves, especially low-income people. And we want to see that right now too. We want to see that from the city, and I think the leadership is there at our city right now to specifically understand the impacts of diesel on low-income and people of color communities, and to enact very strong action to hold accountable those that have had the most impact, and to generate funds for improving that and really centering those resources in the hands of low-income people and people of color. So those are some of the things that we're starting to think about, and certainly would love the partnership and good thinking of a lot of the good folks that are on this phone call or webinar as we move forward. And the last thing I would note here is really just how important it is to understand the limited capacity of community during this COVID crisis. 35% of the infections are in the Latinx community, even though we only have 13% of the population. And what that means in practical sense is that people are so busy taking care of each other and making sure that we're going to be able to survive what essentially is an existential crisis for many of our communities, that we simply don't have time to be getting on webinars and being advocates. But that doesn't mean we don't care. That doesn't mean we don't want to. That means we need to make greater investments in our communities, whether that's the technology we need to participate, whether that's resources to pay folks so that they can opt out of their current employment and be able to do this kind of work. We need to accelerate that investment, and that investment needs to come from the local, the regional, and the state level, and it needs to come right now. Thanks.
Great, Tony. We can always count on you for a call to action. We'll come back to that at the end of the meeting as well. Anna, for you, we've heard from Mary and Tony. I'll just assume, since y'all are based in Eugene, that there's a lot of folks in the Eugene, Springfield, Lane County area. But can you contextualize this for your community? Who are we talking about? What is the work that Beyond Toxic is doing and engaged in to address this?
Yeah, thanks for that. And so for Beyond Toxics, in the past 10 years, we've been organizing in what we call our West Eugene neighborhood, where we have seen a clear connection between residential proximity to polluting manufacturers and reporting of health problems in Eugene. So West Eugene is the zip code 97402. It's home to an industrial corridor that's made up of 35 manufacturing companies. And altogether, those companies have released 684,159 pounds of toxic chemicals into the environment. That's like 96% of all the chemicals being released in the city of Eugene. So this one area is having multiple companies release these chemicals. And many of these industries are located close to homes, like right across the street, close to neighborhoods that, again, leads to ongoing chronic exposures of toxic chemicals. And this area of West Eugene also has its own legacy of injustice, where some of the first Black community members had been relocated to due to exclusionary laws. So this has played an important role to perpetuate the unhealthy conditions we see today. We've been organizing, and we've been prior to COVID, we were going out every Saturday collecting environmental health surveys with community members. So we had done this in 2011, was the first time we started collecting information from the community, and we did it again in 2019. And when we conducted it, we've seen that there hasn't been much change. We've been advocating for stronger regulation, for polluters to be held accountable, but our results remain the same from 2011 to 2019. And yeah, we focused in 3 main areas where we collected a lot of our door-to-door surveys, where we were able to gather the data. And again, the areas where we collected this information, there are industrial facilities to the north and south of those residential neighborhoods. Again, we are actively researching the toxics that are being released by these companies. We research just like the top 3 chemicals, because there's many chemicals, so you can't research them all. But we've researched the top 3 for the companies that are being emitted out there. And West Eugene, and like what health impacts they've been associated with. And again, we know, so some of the most commonly reported health problems in West Eugene include respiratory problems, cancer, and skin rashes. So like in 2019, manufacturers in the West Eugene Industrial Corridor just released 90,000 pounds of acetone into the environment. Research shows that acetone inhalation is associated with damage to the lungs and nasal passages in children and adults. And for example, in 2003, a study found that Latinx children exposed to acetone are more likely to report asthma symptoms, and that's what we're hearing from community members out in West Eugene. A lot of them reporting asthma, or their children reporting asthma. Manufacturers also released 34,484 pounds of benzene and benzene containing compounds into West Eugene. Multiple agencies have classified benzene as a carcinogen, cancer-causing substance, and multiple studies report benzene to cause cancers, including bone marrow, colon cancer, lung cancer, and one study connected mothers exposed during pregnancy and an increased risk of leukemia in their children. And so we collected all of this information from individuals, and we did a statistical analysis on all of this data that we collected from our community. And again, there's evidence to suggest that West Eugene and Bethel households are more likely to report asthma than the rest of Eugene. We also collected information from people who don't live in the 97402 zip code. The detection of toxics increased the likelihood of households reporting asthma, linking environmental contamination with reporting asthma. Again, children's asthma rates in West Eugene are double the percentage than in other areas of Eugene. So there's a 14% of people reporting asthma, children's asthma, than 7% in the rest of Eugene. Households that reported detecting air toxics nearby their residents were more likely to report respiratory or lung problems. This suggests that environmental contamination is associated with poor health outcomes. So again, a lot of the makeup of this community in West Eugene is low income. There is a percentage of of people of color in this neighborhood as well. And when we look at So all the people in this area already have underlying health conditions, are already experiencing health impacts. And so when we look at a map of COVID tracking for our county, the 97402 zip code, the area in West Eugene, has the highest number of positive COVID cases. So again, they are already having the health problems, and then they are impacted again by COVID that are located in this area. So that's what we're looking at when we look at West Eugene for us here in the Eugene Springfield area. That's where most of our work has been done, working with community members, providing resources, doing community meetings in order to keep informing our community about what's happening. And we get calls all the time from people sharing their stories with us about what it's like for them, and they know, and they feel that something is happening as they've lived there. If I can share like a quick quote from somebody who's filled out one of our story collection forms. She's like, I recently bought a home on Royal Avenue. We're a younger couple in our 30s, and this is our first home. We love this home, but when we moved in, we noticed the thick metallic rubbery smell in the air. This can occur at any time, day or night. Not only does it make being outside in our yard unbearable at times, it makes us less likely to walk our dog in Peterson Park or around the neighborhood. I filed multiple complaints with LRAPA and had it confirmed that at the times of my complaints, we were downwind of J.H. Baxter. Shortly after we bought our home, some friends of ours moved into the neighborhood on Fairfield. They also noticed the horrible smell, but it's much stronger being in closer proximity to the plant. Given that we just had a newborn, the pollution is a big reason they don't plan to buy a house in the neighborhood. I wish we would have known sooner. We love this neighborhood and want to stay here. Every company should do its part to not pollute our land, soil, and air. It's absurd that this hasn't been handled already. So a lot of people, this isn't an uncommon story that people share with us.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And I appreciate you bringing that first person perspective, right? That story to really help us kind of hold and feel what communities experience. And each of you have talked about, right, whether it's Cesar Chavez School, whether it was Cully Neighborhood, West Eugene, these are the stories of environmental justice realities all across this country, both historically and contemporaneously. So I appreciate that kind of contextualizing of, when we talk about EJ, environmental justice, we're really talking about the experiences of communities that we can see, people that we can know, right? These are real people, real human beings. I've been interested in understanding, as we're watching really movements take place in real time around racial justice, around health justice, what we're seeing on our streets in our communities. We have these two pandemics that are affecting our global and local communities. And as I know we prepared for this conversation, I think each of you talked a bit about tactics and strategies for creating change. I think, Mary, you had used the frame, the promise and potential, right, of policy and regulation, but I would also offer, right, the promise and potential of movements, right, to protect and ensure the health and well-being of community. And, Tony, you had talked about how capacity has been impacted by COVID and, of course, the day-to-day realities, right, and concerns of communities that are not just, kind of responding to this public health pandemic, but, of course, all of the rippling effects of that in terms of people's day-to-day lives. So, Tony, I'll ask you, you started that localized example of Cully and, of course, talked about the hazards, kind of the myriad hazards and issues that affect that community. But you also talked about the incredible civic engagement that's happening there. And we've often, both as a movement and I think, as community, kind of look to policy change. We just got to change the policy or get some more regulation as a way to protect community. I'd love to hear your perspective about policy and legal approaches to the work and why or why not that approach, maybe that approach alone, can or can't serve to best protect our communities.
Yeah, I always think of the Frederick Douglass quote that, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and never will. And I think, I think the my perception of the downside of the modern environmental movement over the last 50 years, that's been a predominantly middle-class, white-led movement, has been that it has moved toward an ever more specialized and technical space, and that certainly has created gains. I'm someone who I've served on the board of Earth Justice for the last 9 years, and deeply value the ability of good attorneys to represent our communities for free and win substantial gains in protecting communities and advancing ever progressive changes in the Clean Air Act, for example. But it's really clear to me, in sort of being a student of history as well, that none of that happens without the mass movement of people, without the mobilization of people, and usually, always those that have been most disenfranchised, most impacted. And so that's where I think, when we call for investment, the investment that we call for is the investment in people. And that was really what drove, I think, a number of our organizations to pass the Portland Clean Energy Fund 2 years ago, the only climate initiative to pass anywhere in the country in November of 2018. Sad but true fact. But the fund creates, resources that are prioritized for low income, people of color, disability serving, community organizations, to invest in the organizations that serve those communities, the people that serve those communities, the people that are active in those communities, to aggressively address climate. And it posits that by creating ways to invest in people, that really helps to build the capacity of communities to articulate and demonstrate what we already know to be true. We already know to be true that we value a healthy environment, that we know how to have a healthy environment and a healthy economy at the same time. It's not that complicated, but it's really complicated for wealthy white men who have had that power and had that wealth for a long time, because it's about losing that power, losing that wealth, and having to redistribute that power and wealth among folks that it's been excluded from. And that, to me, is where things start to really intertwine. And what I'm really interested in is how a movement to this ongoing movement to address air quality in our neighborhoods and our communities that has ravaged our communities for so long and has taken so many lives, how it is the same movement as a movement to end white supremacy. And it is the same movement as the movement to end patriarchy, but we often don't name it that way. And I think the environmental movement, for sure, the mainstream environmental movement, hasn't named it that way. But that's changing, and it's really heartening to see how the work of so many, and Ben, you're not able to toot your own horn here, but I'll toot it for you, is like, people like Ben in our community here. I met Ben 20 years ago working on some crazy project called the PACE, Environmental Health Project, and it was about like, how do we center the needs and priorities of low-income people, people of color, in the frame of environmental justice in Oregon, but really more importantly about how do we dismantle white supremacy and patriarchy so that those systems no longer are dictating how, where, and when investments are made to improve environmental air quality, how policies are made, and investing in the people to say, this is what we need, this is how we need it, this is when it needs to happen, and this is the way it's going to happen. And what's really exciting for me is that we've been engaging in an experiment for a long time now with environmental protection, and it's largely not working. Whether that's climate or air or water or salmon, we need to engage in a radically new experiment and flip the script. Invest 100% in people of color led, frontline community led. We're going to do this with an energy democracy campaign, statewide campaign, 100% renewables, much more aggressive timeline, invest in 100 people around the state to understand, take agency over our energy and climate policy making, low-income people, people of color, tribal people. It's well past time. It's well past time to engage in that kind of practice. And we need time to practice. We need time to lift our wings and fly in those spaces. And that's what's so exciting to me is people have always said yes to that. Mainstream environmental movement has said no. Funders have said no. That's shifting. People are saying, okay, I'm ready to share power. I'm a little bit ready to share the resources. Not really. Let's start saying yes. Let's start saying yes. We want to share the power. We want to share the resources. We know the answers are there. As my longtime friend and mentor, Maxine Fitzpatrick from PCRI, always told me, the solutions are always in the places where people are at that are closest to the problem. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tony. Between you and Mary, I guess you're showing how I've earned some of these white whiskers, dating some of this work. Mary, perhaps you can, really build off this. Obviously you spent the last decade navigating the kind of political and community spaces around diesel particulate impacts, and really talking about what potential you see. We just talked about kind of using an equity lens, or, quite frankly, what Oregon state law requires for natural resource agencies, the quote, consideration of environmental justice impacts for improving the ways that we create, implement, and ensure that policy approaches actually work for community. And I know we had a question in the chat about kind of place in all policy, which I think actually connects to that concept a little bit and may relate to your response to that. And also a question, I'm just going to load it on for you. A question also about the tendency to have industry regulate themselves, which I know all of us have probably been in conversation around at some point. And finally, another question that was, I think, really related to Beyond Toxic, but I think, I'm going to ask you maybe to speak more broadly about compromise and negotiation. So there's a lot there, but how do we kind of get driven by the principles and practices of environmental justice when we're really engaging in policy work? And how do we ensure that we kind of stay true to those values as we, advocate for change?
Wow, did I count 6 questions you just threw at me?
Close.
No, and honestly, I'm still hearing some of Tony's words. Some of what Tony just said just really resonated with me, and about this moment in time, about the unique opportunity we have to rethink, honestly, our expectations of outcomes as much as, our approach. I think we've been really stilted. And I want to give some huge kudos to Beyond Toxics. I started this work 10 plus years ago, and honestly, I wasn't thinking I needed to, establish a whole nother nonprofit and be in this space. I was looking around for who is in this space. And Beyond Toxics really stood out as an organization that was working at the, at the level of where our error and our regulations impact people, our environment and the intersections with people. And that was what really missing in the bigger green movement. And I was really astounded that, there weren't organizations dealing with as big a problem as air pollution, and wondering why that was. And what I realized is that, especially in the Northwest, there has been a huge emphasis on the natural resources as a component of our economy. And it's been a really, and so how we're going to regulate that in a balanced way. And that's very much a paradigm based on, if it's white supremacy and patriarchy, those are also emboldening capitalism and what we've built our economy around. And so we really were sort of stuck in this space where we had to deal with the fact that the economy is still supreme. And, and when you're considering like the value of a vista or of a fish, but when you're considering the value of a human life, that's where it really falls short. And I think that we are seeing more and more a massive opportunity to rethink that paradigm of what we value in our communities. And so, So I'm probably way off topic in terms of, Ben, where you wanted me to go with a specific answer around that. But I just want to thank Beyond Toxics for their leadership in this. I mean, I think, you know, as I said, when I started, they were already doing those surveys, knocking on people's doors, asking them, what, you know, what's happening in your life? You live next to industry, and finding these intersections. And that was not happening anywhere. I mean, I remember a DHS officials testifying, saying, you know, we do biogenetic research on fish, and we don't do it on humans. We don't have that. So I think that the opportunity that we have to lift the human life as the valuable commodity that it is, and the necessary protection that we need to do with our environmental gives us. And that was my, you know, I first met you, Ben, as an environmental health person. And I was so, again, it was so difficult for me to understand why there was a disconnect between public health policy and environmental policy. I didn't understand why that disconnect. And I think we're starting to see that be broken down. But we need a radical shift. And that is the you know, as scary, and I live downtown, and as you know, in many, I mean, the virus is scary. The protests and the movement is exciting and really inspiring to see the level of change and demand. And I just actually watched a really great video that one of our city commissioners, Joanne Hardesty, shared, that a local artist had made about the movement, and basically trying to explain, like, you know, the talk is starting to go in the right direction, but until the actual policy changes, we're still going to be here, and we're going to still stand and be talking about this. And I think that's what we need to be doing on the environment, is we need to continue to say that the human, you know, experience is supreme and should not be valued over the economic model. And we need to break apart that. And frankly, there isn't a lot of evidence that shows, I mean, if you look at the history of the Clean Air Act, you actually see massive, and if you look at the you know, experience of California that has some of the strongest regulations, you see massive GDP growth, if that's something that you want to value, that runs in conjunction with stronger and stricter regulations. We do better, actually, when we do it clean and efficient and we innovate. So it's also a false narrative, and that's what I get really frustrated about in the politicking of it, is that, you know, oftentimes as a mom activist, you know, I'm considered like the worried well, the scared, you know, not necessarily based in reality. I will say it's not, I don't even come close to the hyperbolic statements that are taken as fact from our industry and our opposition forces against stronger regulations. And it is, I think that's what we need to break apart. You know, we really need to start to, I am happy to talk, and you've mentioned the compromise, and that's why, you know, I am happy to talk with anybody about the real impacts to their business that creating a safer environmental policy might happen. Let's start there. But it's really frustrating to have to talk about these hyperbolic and frankly fantasies about impacts that just aren't real. And yet the impacts that we're experiencing, the human health impacts, are well documented, and they are real, and people's lives are being really affected. So I think that the context that we're living within right now allows us to say, you know what, if the current paradigm doesn't work, let's get a new one, let's shift it. And I think what Tony spoke to it really makes me hopeful that we have this opportunity, that our movement in this region that is being led now by a different voice and led by that demand. And I'm really excited to see the emerging leadership that's coming into this space that really just didn't even exist 10 years ago. You know, that where, a group like Beyond Toxics really stood alone in that space. And now there are multiple voices really emerging and developing better competency, but also agency and voice in this. And it's really exciting. So I'm very hopeful right now.
I appreciate that, Mary, and I think anytime we can hold hope is positive. And I love the way you talked about, both this kind of reimagination and the kind of challenging of status quo, challenging of these paradigms that have been so toxic, both kind of literally and figuratively, but also that concept of voice. And maybe, Anna, as we think about Beyond Toxic, and I do say, as Mary said, I think it does stand out. And you all are actively organizing in Eugene and beyond, but with a particular focus on, as you described earlier, West Eugene. So I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the tactics and approaches that you all have seen to be most effective, or perhaps if I say that differently, what is Beyond Toxic's theory of change when it comes to environmental justice organizing and advocacy?
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you all for that history lesson of Beyond Toxics, because again, the work that they were doing was way before I got here. And recognizing that Beyond Toxics has been doing a lot of that interconnected work between like health and environmental regulation. And we were working on that with communities. And so our theory of change is, again, just really working with the communities that are most impacted, going out and talking to people and meeting them where they're at. They have the lived experience of what they're experiencing, and they know something's wrong in their neighborhood. And so we're just providing resources for people in order to be able to speak for themselves. We're hosting those community meetings and making them accessible to the community members out in West Eugene. And some of the tactics that we've been able to stay within this conversation of environmental regulation and air quality is our executive director, Lisa. She's been fierce and tenacious, and we're just always there bringing up the same topic and bringing it and like just drilling it home to people that like this is not going to go away. It's here, and until we can address it, will we see any change in our communities. And so I think that's been a really strong quality that has helped us influence and move things forward. It's just that tenacity of not giving up, because we wholeheartedly believe that our policies should be based on a health from health, a human health perspective, is one of the things that that really drew me to work with Beyond Toxics, and why we're still in this work so long afterwards. Because I think one of the things, it's like we can't keep asking our communities to change their own practices, their own individual practices, when industries and companies are still having harmful practices that impact their health. It's like, how can we ask them to do something when these companies that are polluting are not changing their practices, and regulation is not addressing that?
Great, thank you. So I'm thinking that maybe we can do a little bit of Q&A and then come back to some closing statement. I know folks have asked about having a grid view, so I don't know if that's possible for the organizers, but I'm gonna take the liberty as a moderator because there's a young organizer who posed a question. His name is Rudy Duncan, known as alternatively as my 9-year-old son, and the next generation of activists doing this work. But Rudy really talked about, Rudy's school in the Lent neighborhood in Portland is right at the fence line of I-205. This is school literally, right? You can hear the hum of vehicular traffic. And his question was really around, what he sees in his school is a lot of kids with asthma. And I think his question, and maybe this is for you, Mary, is really, wants to know, is there a relationship there, right? To, there's a highway here and the kids in my school have asthma. Could you talk about that relationship and maybe some of the things that, a 9-year-old can start thinking about in terms of their own activism and organizing?
Well, thank you for that question, Ben. Again, 10 years ago, public health folks wanted to say there wasn't a connection, and we've learned, and emerging science tells us there really is. And what we do understand as well is that there is certainly a connection in the exacerbation of asthma and high levels of particulates that would come off of combustion from freeway proximity. And then, and so you're also dealing with, you know, asthma, which might be controllable in another setting, or if you know what might exacerbate your asthma, you know, you're in a school environment, you can't really control that, and you can't change that. So I do think we are finding that, you know, that was also an issue with, we worked with, so for Rudy, and thank you, Rudy, for asking this question, we have been working and talking with a lot of the students at the Harriet Tubman School. Harriet Tubman is quintessentially, you know, a story of how this intersects, all of our policies intersect. And there is a school that's located in a fantastic neighborhood and a you know, place where the community really values, but has been decimated by our freeway transportation policy, infrastructures, industry. It was actually, frankly, the high levels of cadmium and arsenic that were found in the Moss Service study were documented, well documented at the Harriet Tubman School for a decade ahead of that. But it was never, you know, nothing ever happened. So here you have a school. And so we've been working and talking with those kids a lot. And asthma is, you know, time and time again, when you talk about the stories and you talk about the personal experiences, it is the story that comes up most. Some of those kids that we talked about, there's a really great environmental justice student group there that has been working for a couple of years. They've joined us down in Salem. They talk to their legislators. And oftentimes their testimony and their personal stories are not just even about their own, but about their younger siblings and their family. And that this is, you know, and because your school environment is just one piece of a life that is place-based and community-based. And so you spend however many hours at your school, and then the rest of your experience is usually within a relative circle of that same spot. So yes, there are correlations. You know, there is still a lot we don't understand about asthma, but we do understand that air pollution certainly triggers and exacerbates it. We understand, you know, air pollution is adding to other respiratory. The one thing that really interests me is that there's been a lot of effort to address school absenteeism, because it's a really big problem in determining the, you know, successful, you know, the long-term success of any individual is staying in school. And then we've actually learned that the single biggest factor that is why kids miss school is for health problems. The single biggest health problem is respiratory, and asthma is the #1 contributor there. So there is a direct correlation. And then a study about clean diesel buses up in Washington State actually demonstrated that they lowered absenteeism. They improved school attendance by cleaning up the diesel that these kids were exposed to. So yes, you know, sometimes, and this is the paradigm shift we have to make sometimes, and I try not to do it loosely or lightly, and I try and stick with the really good experts like the Ben Duncans and the other public health experts, but sometimes you have to use your intuition. Precautionary principle is an intuitive idea, you know, and as a parent, that comes really naturally. And I suspect, Rudy, that your dad understands that we would much rather prevent something before we have to deal with a negative thing in your life. And it seems so intuitive to me to address. And, you know, Harriet Tubman, it was going to be really difficult to address those externalities. What we did get is Portland Public Schools invested millions of dollars in a new HVAC system for that school. So the students inside Harriet Tubman, in those hours they're inside that school, they're breathing the cleanest air in the Portland Public School District. I think that is the type of policy that should become not an anomaly. That should be the type of policy that's given to every single school, every school bond. We should be instituting that HVAC engineering to ensure that everybody's breathing clean, safe air inside their schools because of the amount of time we know kids are in those schools. So Rudy, thank you. And I'd be happy to come to your school and talk to you more about this and talk to your friends.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I'm sure that offer will be taken up. I'll be having an HVAC conversation this afternoon, I'm sure. But also, I mean, you talked a lot about kind of place, right? And there's a whole history, of course, around where highways have been constructed in the United States that directly relates to systemic and institutional racism. Certainly, I think, when many of you have talked about the kind of economic analysis, right? That cost benefit, preventing, not just, school absenteeism, right? But recognizing that, children with asthma are also showing up in emergency rooms. So as we can, mitigate that, we do avoid costs. One of the other questions, and I, Anna, you had mentioned, this conflict between kind of what could you ask individuals to do versus the kind of broader institutional, systemic, kind of industry-wide. But there was connections. But there was a few questions around, idling, around lawnmowers, around leaf blowers. And I think folks just looking like what actions can we take, whether that's a public campaign or whether that's, neighborhood by neighborhood, kind of looking at mitigating those individual level behaviors. I'll maybe start with you, Anna, just around, is that a conversation that Beyond Toxics is having? Or, how might you push back or support that idea of saying, that's actually not where we're focused because of this broader focus on population level health?
I'm trying to understand the question a little bit better, but yes, a lot of the time I think, and we encounter that too when we work in our West Eugene neighborhood, of people are really concerned about this is happening to me right now. And so for us, it's like we do have those conversations with individuals and trying to work with them of like trying to connect those dots to like the broader level of like, we're working on this when it comes to like a regulation and trying to tie them into those bigger conversations. So like trying to tie them into having them join us having them join us at a meeting with LRAPA so that they can share their experience, or tying them into public input, so that like, yes, it's the individual, like this is their concerns, but tying them of like, this is where you can have that impact as well, on this level of like going to the LRAPA meeting, giving public input, holding virtual meetings with us so that we can develop those concerns and questions that they have.
Yeah, I appreciate that, right? Like I have concerns that I'm smelling the exhaust from a lawnmower, and kind of taking that to the next level, right? How do you build upon that? Maybe this is for Tony. There was a question about the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which seems like it's up your alley. And I think it was really a question around hope. I mean, I think part of it was specific to, will that help with diesel particulate? But maybe you could talk a little bit about just your experience with the Portland Clean Energy Fund, and where do you have hope, maybe holding on to that frame?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. And, and also to speak to Rudy's question, Rudy, be simple and radical in your demands to power, right? I think that's what we need right now. And I think that's where you ended up, Mary, was saying like, hey, the Portland Clean Energy Fund was a simple demand. It demanded accountability from the nation's largest retailers with over $1 billion in revenue, and said 1%, we're going to increase your business license fee to operate in the city of Portland by 1%. And that generates $40 to $60 million a year for those investments in the communities that need it the most. And I think it's, what always occurs to me is, we often are perceived nationally as this very green and sustainable place, in Portland in particular. And yet here we are talking about dirty air, and here we are in a state that, has no campaign finance limits, has essentially suffered from industry capture, has recently bulked up some of our regulatory staff, but that regulatory staff is very much going to be vulnerable to the budget cuts, so we all need to be very vigilant on that. But now is the time, in this moment, time is up. Time is up for this old way of doing things. Time is up on diesel. Time is up on freeway expansions. Time is up on keeping our dams going. Time is up. And it clears the path. And we have the responsibility to take that path and to show the simplest and most radical solutions. We can do it. We've done it. We built light rail in 1985 when no one else was building light rail. Did it serve our communities? Not really, but we know now that the solutions we create have to center frontline communities in the frame, both as agents of the change and beneficiaries of the results. We can't go back from that knowledge. And so, to me, this whole picture that we've talked about here today is really one where we say to diesel, no mas. You know, we see new pathways and we need to go through them right now, and we can't have incremental change anymore. And I say that as kind of an old dog over here, you know, and I'm not cynical, and I'm just as impatient, and I'm more than willing to get out of the way and support young leadership that has simpler, more radical solutions and provide the technical resources. Come on. And I think they're right in front of us, and we just have to be willing to say, yeah, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to put a fee on all diesel operating in the city of Portland and Multnomah County right now. Hold harmless people of color and women-owned businesses, and make those funds available for swap outs and replacements, and for communities to be able to build their capacity to reroute freight through our city, and on, a PSEF for transportation. We can do it right now and demand that the state legislature have 100% renewable energy in a very short time frame that has high wage standards for workers and high incentives for locally owned businesses across the state, especially in rural areas, to reap the economic benefits of clean power. We can do that right now. So I think this is our moment, as much as it's always been our moment, but it's even more our moment now. And I think it's really critical that we continue to intertwine that with other calls, complementary calls, to end police violence, to end brutality against Black and brown people, to end the ongoing violence against our tribal communities, to end water shutoffs to our tribal communities and others folks are experiencing. They are intertwined, and it's more complicated in some ways, but it's also very simpler in others. So again, many, many thanks to our friends at Beyond Toxics. Much love to you all. Thanks for the good work you've been doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Tony. I love the, we could have a whole conversation of why you're not cynical, but I love it. I love that attitude. I know there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to. There was one around kind of alternatives to diesel, and I think that's probably, maybe that's a separate webinar for the future. But I do want to give you all a chance. I don't think there's any way we can moderate a panel with such incredible organizers and leaders. And I know, Tony, you've been modeling this throughout this call or this conversation about a call to action. So what do you want to leave the audience with? I'm sure there's many folks kind of wondering, what can I do to support this movement? How do I enter it? Where can I take action today? I've been inspired by these three incredible folks, and I want to do something. So maybe to close us out, if each of you could take a minute or two and just say, if you were going to make an ask of the folks on this call, recognizing people are coming from government, community, private sector, et cetera, what would you put out there? And let's start with you, Anna.
Yeah, at Beyond Toxics, we're always working on something, and we always want people to join us in whatever capacity they can. Right now, somebody had asked a question of how do we see the transition happening voluntarily or involuntarily? I think it's a transition to just a better, healthier environment that we want to live in. And so we're hosting for people in Eugene listening sessions. We're part of a statewide coalition and of the Oregon Just Transition Alliance of moving from this extractive economy that extracts our resources and our labor, like Tony was saying, to something that's more regenerative for all of us. So we want people to join us in those community listening sessions. Join us for a meeting at El Rapa when we go. So we want people to be with us in the same fight, in this movement, because it can't be done without them.
Great, thank you. How about you, Mary?
Well, we had a very disappointing run with a petition to our state to deal with the diesel emissions this last, a decision made in March. We had delivered it in December. We petitioned the Environmental Quality Commission to deal with diesel from the biggest sources in our communities, which are indirect sources, which really, you know, would allow us to get at construction equipment and rail yards and places where there are high concentrations and impacting the most folks. But we actually, you know, if nothing else, as disappointing as that decision was, it actually just gave a razor thin focus again to the idea of local action. And what Tony's been talking about and the work that we want to continue building coalition and strength with VERDE in our conversations with city and local government about what we can do and the agency we have. What we do realize is that people don't have the same visceral experience and understanding of the diesel emissions they're impacted by as compared to some of the industry. You know, a factory, you know, looks like something that you can focus on and attack, if you will, and shut down. And diesel sometimes doesn't have that same quality. We are launching a new website. I'll say what's in our air.org is actually going to be transformed into a whole new tool for communities in the local region, Portland right now, based on Portland permits for all construction activity, that's going to give an emissions value for every one of those construction activities so that people can really see. And so for a lot of communities, like Tony said, there are multiple developments happening and construction activity happening, and it's a constant onslaught. And we want people to have the same experience and understanding of this. And so we're launching up also an effort to reach out and you know, communicate, educate, engage folks to build the movement we need. We had 21 member organizations and 5 municipal governments behind asking for this indirect source rule petition that the state said no to. We need people. And that's what we're going to be building a movement in the next 6 months to bring the people and the voices to this movement to finally get rid of diesel in our city and hopefully our state.
Great,
So
thanks, Marion. That's a wonderful model. What's in our air? There was a lot of questions around how folks get more information. That transparency is super important. Tony, be quick.
All right. Well, if you're on this call and you're not a member of Beyond Toxics yet, please join Beyond Toxics. If you haven't joined or made a donation to NAACP of Lane County, please do so. And then I would just challenge folks, you know, get more radical. This is the time. We can't wait any longer. We know that, but it also means we have to stretch. Right? What makes you uncomfortable? Why do you feel like a more incremental approach might be the way you want to continue to pursue, and what might make you uncomfortable about some of the demands that are out there right now around police reform, for example? And if they don't, that's great. But what is it in the environmental space that might make you uncomfortable and say, you know, like, I don't think that's possible. It is possible. Challenge yourself, engage with your own community and our communities here, and let's go and get some more really radical things done. And more to come from us. One of the other things I didn't talk about was Highway Trust Fund. We want to bust the Highway Trust Fund in 2022, get much more resources out for active transportation and transit, stop building more roads. This is part of the work that we have coming in front of us as well.
Simple and radical, Sonny. I love it. Time's up. And I would encourage folks to look at the just transition work that's happening. That is one of those radical reimaginations of how we organize our society. Thank you, Anna, for mentioning that. And I think, Haley, you're going to close us out?
Yes, yeah, I am. Thank you all so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think we had a really great turnout, which I'm really happy about. Thank you to our amazing panelists and our amazing moderator and his son and his great question. I'm so happy we got to hear from him. We definitely appreciate you all taking the time to speak on these important issues and how we can all take action. And I also want to thank my team behind the scenes answering all the questions and helping out with this webinar. And so this webinar recording will be available and posted on our Beyond Toxics website, where you can also find past webinar recordings and other relevant resources, especially the ones that were mentioned today. And so I'm also happy to announce that we will be holding part 2 of this conversation, The Right to a Healthy Workplace, on September 16th at 12 p.m. So keep a lookout for more information. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day and stay safe and healthy out there. So thanks again, everyone.